On April 12, 1968, in the mountains of Aspen, Colorado, to hikers Amanda Turner, age 23, and her boyfriend Nicholas Long, aged 25, went for an 8-mile hike into the backcountry. What they encountered was their worst nightmare when they failed to come home the next day. A search was launched. This is a story as told by Amanda while in the hospital. Nick and I have hiked this trail multiple times before, so we were comfortable with it and never thought anything would ever happen. We woke up pretty early to start our hike, I'd say about 2:30 a.m. We wanted to make it to the summit to see the sunrise. As we parked the car at the trailhead, I remember looking up and seeing how red the moon was. I remember someone mentioning a few days before we were going to experience something called a blood moon. It's the first time I heard of it and actually saw it. I thought it looked neat, but spooky at the same time. The 8-mile hike to the summit is hard and intense, but that's what we love about it. It's challenging but feels good once you reach the top. As we hiked through the night, we talked and laughed about many things. This helps take your mind off of the pain your feet are feeling. I remember looking up at the blood moon a lot during the hike in and wondered what exactly made the moon to be red. Welcome to Dark Rot Legends. Where fear takes form and shadows tell their stories. Let's begin. Asked Nick about it and he said he didn't know either. For some reason I couldn't get the thought of the blood moon out of my head. After hours of hiking, we made it to the summit around 7:30 a.m. I think just in time to see the sun crest the mountain tops. It was chilly on top, but the weather was going to be warm, so we decided the day before we wanted to spend the day up high and start hiking. Back in the early afternoon, there are a lot of places to explore in the basin just below the peak we summit. We'd brought food and had enough water, so we didn't have to worry about running out. After watching the sunrise for a while and waiting until it warmed up, we decided to head back down to the big basin below us so we could start exploring. This trail usually has a lot of other hikers on it, and this day was no different. As we hiked down the trail, we could see a dozen other hikers making their way towards us on their way to the summit. Once we reached the basin, I said, Nick, let's cut over to the left. It's an area we've never really ventured into and I want to see if we can find the old plane crash site. Sounds good. I was thinking the same thing, Nick responded. A plane had crashed somewhere in the area back in the 40s, and I was curious to see what was left, if we could even find it. We hiked for probably 3/4 of a mile as we looked for the old crash site when suddenly Nick blurted out, hey, I think I see what looks like an engine and some white debris. That's got to be it. Oh yeah, I see it now too, I responded. We walked over to it and could see it was definitely the crash site. The plane's engine was huge and a lot of the debris was gone, probably due to people scavenging it over the years. There were still some bigger pieces of the plane's wings that were too big to carry off. After checking out the crash site for a bit, we decided it was time to take a nap. It was about 10 a.m. by then, and we were running on only a few hours of sleep and needed to rest up for the hike out, which was quite a ways from where we were at. We picked a nice spot not too far from the crash site, laid down and started to sleep. The weather and temperature were perfect for a nice nap. There were also no bugs disturbing us. Being it's still early in the spring, this caused us to sleep for a long time. When we woke up, to our surprise, it was already 4 p.m. I can't believe we slept that long. How was that possible? I asked. Yeah, I can't believe it either. Crazy, Nick responded. Let's eat something before we head back down. I'm starving, I said. Yep, we're going to need the energy, Nick replied. As we ate our sandwiches, I started thinking to myself, damn, we're going to be hiking out in the dark. I don't mind hiking up the mountain in the early morning, but for some reason I never liked hiking down the mountain in the evening when it's dark, even if it is a full moon. My thoughts then went back to the blood moon again. After we finished eating, we stuffed everything into our backpack and took off, heading back the way we'd come. We needed to connect to the trail before we made the trek down the mountain. When we made it back to the trail, I could see the sun beginning to set behind a large peak we'd summited in the morning. This meant we only had an hour left of sunlight, but we had a 3-hour hike out. I'm glad we always bring flashlights, I thought to myself. Well, Amanda, let's get going, said Nick as he started making his way down the trail. As we hiked along, it seemed like we were the last ones on the mountain. We've been hiking for about an hour when it started getting dark enough we'd have to start using our flashlights. We each had our own, as Nick a lot faster than me and was always in the lead. We switched on our lights and continued hiking for a bit. When we came to the top of another large basin, Nick, who had a bit of a lead, suddenly stopped dead in his tracks, causing me to run into the back of him. What's going on? I asked him. Look down there in the bottom of the basin, you see that light? It's got to be close to the trail. I've been watching it go around in a big circle for a bit now, replied Nick. Oh yeah, I see it. What are they doing? That's weird. Why would they be going around in a large circle like that over and over again? I asked. I'm not sure, but something weird is going on, responded to Nick. Right then the light suddenly turned off. We looked at each other with concerned looks, but said nothing. The spot where the light turned off was about a mile away, and we knew we'd have no choice but to pass a spot in order to get out. It wasn't like we could avoid it by going around it, being the trees and bushes in that specific area were thick. We were tired and it was dark. As I continued hiking down the trail, my eyes were glued to the spot we'd seen the light right before it turned off. After about 30 minutes of hiking, we were fairly close to the spot we'd seen the light shut off. Instinctively, we both slowed down, with Nick stopping and waiting for me to catch up to him. We're almost to the spot, we'll take it slow. Whoever it was still has to be in there, as I've been watching the area the entire hike down and never saw the light come back on, whispered Nick. Okay, I'll stay close to you, I whispered back. We started slowly creeping along when all of a sudden somebody blurted out from behind us, "Hi, I'm Theodore, but everybody calls me Ted." Nick and I nearly jumped out of our skin as we quickly turned around in fear, shining our lights on the person who just spoken. There before us, standing directly on the trail in the dark, was a man. You know, if you turn your flashlights off, you can see the blood moon really well. I recommend you turn off your lights, the man said. We're going, so I think we'll leave them on, but thanks anyway, replied Nick. I was now standing behind Nick, looking at the creepy man who stood before us. The man, who called himself Ted again, said, I recommend turning off your flashlight so you can see the blood moon. It's quite exhilarating as you hike. Nick didn't respond back to him. Instead, he glanced back at me and whispered, let's back up slowly until he's out of sight, then turn around and continue hiking. Something is not right with him. I nodded my head and simply said okay. I was scared out of my mind and wanted to get as much distance as I could between us and the man. Well, good evening to you, sir, said Nick, as we started slowly backing away from him. As we backed up, I'll never forget the look on the man's face. He was grinning, and it wasn't the nice, pleasant grin you'd get from a friend. It was an eerie grin, like he was planning something. Once the man was out of our line of sight, we immediately turned around and started quickly hiking down the trail. The uncomfortable thought went through my mind that we still had quite a ways before we reached the trailhead. There was no choice but to press on as fast as we could, while still being careful, as it's easy to fall and get injured on this trail. We decided I'd be in the lead and Nick would be behind me, as I was too scared to be in the back. As we hiked along, I couldn't get the man's sinister looking grin out of my head. We've been hiking for a while and started to enter another part of the trail that also has a long stretch of thick bushes. This makes it so you can only see a few feet in front of you. As we were making our way through the thick bushes, Nick suddenly stopped and said, did you hear that? I immediately stopped in my tracks and whispered loudly as I shook from fear. Hear what? It sounded like someone is running behind us. It's got to be that man, replied Nick. Tried shining his light on the trail too. see if he could see what it was, but again we could only see for a few feet. Nick then turned around and said, "Come on, let's keep going. The faster we go, the sooner we'll get back to the car." I turned around and continued hiking. When I then heard what Nick had been hearing, the sound of someone or something running up behind us. I then heard Nick yell out, "What do you want, man?" I immediately turned around to see the man running up to Nick, arms raised with a big stick in his hand, still grinning. Nick put up his arms in a defensive position, but it was too late. The man struck Nick on the head, sending him down to the ground, knocking him out. I quickly ran up to Nick to try and help him when the man struck me on the head. As well, I remember falling down next to Nick as my eyes started to water and blood started running down my forehead. The man then came and stood over me, looked down at me and said with a smile, "I told you to turn your lights off. The blood moon is so much better in the dark." He then swung the stick down at me, hitting me on the head again. This time I blacked out. The next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of birds chirping and feeling very cold. As I opened my eyes, I realized I was on my back looking up at the morning sky. For a few brief seconds I completely forgotten about what took place the night before. The throbbing pain in my head reminded me of what happened. I slowly sat up as I touched my head to see how badly injured I was. I could feel the dry, crusted blood that covered my forehead. I looked down at my shirt and could see it too was covered in blood. I started looking around for Nick but could not see him. It was then I realized I had no idea where I was. I didn't recognize my surroundings at all. I shouted out, "Nick, Nick," but there was no answer. I quickly remembered the man and thought he could still be in the area, so I decided to remain quiet. I sat there for a while deciding what I should do next. Once I felt good enough, I stood up to see if I could get my bearings, but again, as I looked around me, it was obvious I was somewhere I've never been. I sat back down and ran some ideas around my head. Should I try hiking around to see if I can find the trail? Should I stay put and hope someone finds me? The number one thing on my mind, though, was Nick. I was deathly worried about him as the uncertainty of it all overtook me. Emotionally, my mind then wandered back to something my father told me when I was younger. If you ever get lost in the mountains, stay put and wait until someone finds you. The more you hike, the more lost you can get. For some reason that had always stuck with me. I remained in the exact spot until I heard people shouting my name. Then I worked my way towards the shouting and found the search and rescue team. Amanda was taken down the mountain by the search and rescue team and treated at the hospital for a gash and concussion. On April 14th, Nick was found over a mile away from Amanda's location in another canyon. He'd been stabbed multiple times and thrown over a cliff, luckily alleged 10 feet below caught his fall, otherwise he would have fallen to his death. He spent several weeks in the hospital recovering. Multiple witnesses at the trailhead reported to police that on April 12th, they'd met a strange, good-looking, overly friendly man who drove a tan-colored Volkswagen Beetle. The car was reported as being parked there all day, with other witnesses saying they saw it parked there on the morning of the 13th as well. The man was never found or identified. For more scary horror stories, please subscribe. Thank you for joining Dark Rot Legends. Subscribe for more tales of terror. If you dare.